Today's daf we're going to be learning is Yoma Samach Gimel. Today's daf is dedicated by an anonymous sponsor in memory of Menachem Mendel ben Levi Yitzchak, Lubavitcher Rebbe. We are learning L'iloi Nishmato. Okay, we're starting at the bottom of Samach Bet Amud Bet. Okay, not the most simple daf, I'll warn you in advance. There's also a lot of new concepts. Some of them we've seen already, but for people who maybe started in Masechet Yoma, maybe less. Maybe less, more new, and also even if you learn Masechet Pesachim, you might not remember all the details, so we'll go back through them and build up on them. What we're going to talk about is mainly this topic of shchutei chutz, slaughtering something outside the temple, okay, something that's supposed to be done inside and is then slaughtered outside. The Torah says you are liable for this. You get actually karet if you do it. So we saw in yesterday's daf, I brought it at the top of today's sheet, that if you have two seirim that were slaughtered outside, right? That you take the two seirim that were supposed to go la Hashem and la Zalzel, and we say there's two options. One is before the lottery was done, and one is after the lottery was done. After the lottery was done, we'll get to more at the bottom of Amud Aleph, but right now we're going to focus on if you haven't yet done the lottery. So what do we say? You're liable for both, okay? If you slaughtered any one of them outside, you're going to be liable, not because Rav Chisda explained, not because of the Hagrala, in other words, because potentially one could have gone Lashem, because neither one, in order for you to be liable for shchutei chutz, it has to be that you could have slaughtered it inside. Now, neither of these could have been slaughtered inside yet because it was what we call mechusar ma'aseh. It was missing an action that doesn't actually, it's not something you change in the animal, but it's something that has to do with the animal, which is the lottery. So without the lottery, you can't slaughter this to God yet, right? You can't do anything with it. So because it's mechusar ma'aseh, that's not the reason why you're going to be liable for shchutei chutz. The reason is because potentially, and here comes one of the big things we're going to talk about, ho'il. Do you remember we have this ho'il? Ho'il is since it could potentially have been used for, it's true you set aside to use for the lottery, but potentially it could have been used for what we call the Shiur for Yom Kippur, for the Musaf offering. There's these additional offerings you bring, and one of them is a Shiur. Since you could have used that same one of those goats for that, they're all potentially ready for use on that day, even though some things have to happen until you can do that. You have to go through the Avodat Yom Kippur, you have to do also. But still, that's called Mechusar Zman. Mechusar Zman doesn't, if it's that day, we say you could have done it, you're going to be liable for shchutei chutz. Comes Ravina, and he says, we're starting now 4 lines from the bottom of Samach Bet Amud Bet. Since Rav Chisda said that it's only because potentially it could have been used for the Shiur for Musaf, but not because it could have gone through the lottery and ended up being the one that went to God and sacrificed, and that's why you're not allowed to slaughter it outside. He says that mechusar hagrala is mechusar ma'aseh, right? It's missing an action associated with it, the hagrala. And that's why, that's not the reason why you're liable, because you're missing something major. Well, in that case, I'm going to take something that Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, says Ravina, and I'm going to add that to what Rav Chisda said, and I'm going to come up with another halachic conclusion, which is, Rav Yehuda when he said, shlamim, now we're on a totally different topic. It's still shchutei chutz, but we're going to have a case where you're liable for shchutei chutz, or you're not going to be liable, we'll say. Shlamim sheshachatan kodem sheniftechu latot ha'echal psulin. Okay, so Rav Yehuda, we're not yet on shchutei chutz. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel that if you take a korban shlamim, peace offering, and you offer it in the temple before they open the doors of the sanctuary, okay, you're not allowed, now you slaughter outside the sanctuary, but it can't be slaughtered until the doors of the sanctuary are opened. It's pasul, it doesn't work. So if you did it before the sanctuary doors opened, it's disqualified. How do we know this? Shenemar v'shachato petach ol moed, because it says you have to slaughter it by the opening of ol moed. Ol moed is parallel in the temple to the sanctuary. Bizman shu patuach v'lo bizman shu na'ul. Okay, so that's what Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel. The shlamim offering has to be offered when the doors of the temple are open. If you haven't yet opened the doors, so now let's go one step further. So if you didn't open the doors, and now let's say you slaughtered that animal that was supposed to be a korban shlamim, that was supposed to be sacrificed after you opened the doors, but you slaughtered it outside the temple, but you did it before the doors were opened. That's going to be called a mechusar ma'aseh that relates to the animal, right? That's a ma'aseh that you have to do, open the doors before you do a korban shlamim, just like you have to do a lottery before you can offer up the Shiur LaHashem. So it's equivalent. So therefore he says, shachatam b'chutz kodem sheniftechu dvatot ha'echal patur. So you're going to be exempt before you open Becky, you're saying the Petach doesn't mean doors, you mean it means the gate. Is that what you're saying? I'm not sure what you're saying. It doesn't mean doors. But before you open the gates to the sanctuary, then you're going to be exempt. So again, what do you have here? You have mechusar ma'aseh. So basically, Ravina is saying we apply what Chisda said about the lottery, missing a lottery, also to here. So again, you're going to have a case where you're exempt from shchutei chutz because you were missing some action related to the sacrifice. Now let's go back to Rav Chisda in general. Rav Chisda said, now again, what we equated here was the Shiur is not Ra'oi LaHashem right now, and it's not Ra'oi LaZalzel yet because it hasn't undergone a lottery. However, you're still going to be liable for shchutei chutz because it could be potentially used, even though you weren't planning to use it for that, but it can be potentially used for this musaf sacrifice. So now the Gemara asks, wait a minute. Umi ile Rav Chisda hoil? Does Rav Chisda hold by this principle of potentials? That since you could potentially use it, where was the most famous that we saw this? Remember in Pesachim? They're going to quote a different case, and the Gemara is going to question the Rishonim. Some of the Rishonim ask, or Achronim, why don't they connect? Why don't they bring up the other machloket here? And they come up. I saw a commentary that came up with a distinction. It was quoted in the Koran. If you remember, there's a famous machloket Rabba and Rav Chisda. Remember that it's Rabba because in a few minutes we'll get to Rabba. Whether you can cook on Yantif for the next day, and you could say maybe guests will show up. Remember that whole thing? Can you make more food and say, well, maybe guests will show up? I don't know, right? Maybe. Can you say hoel? Can't you say hoel? Rav Chisda doesn't use hoel for lekula to allow you to permit you things, and Rabba does. So interestingly, they didn't bring up that sugya. Some people say it's because that sugya is different, because the hoel there is not dependent on you. The hoel there is dependent on maybe guests will show up. That's not in your hands at all. So there he's not going to hold hoel. Here, you have the potential to change the korban if you want. You could take that Shiur and use it for a musaf offering. And therefore, since it's in your hands, that's a different, therefore we're not going to compare those cases. Okay. But now, anyway, there's questions there to be asked why this sugya is a reference. But anyway, they say, so does he hold hoel? V'hama Rav Chisda, doesn't Rav Chisda say? Okay, before I continue, I'm going to give you some background. In general, sacrifices, okay, you take an animal, you designate it for a particular sacrifice, and then you slaughter it for that particular sacrifice. We've learned a number of times. What if you slaughter it shelo lishma? You slaughter it with the intent that it's a different one. I take a Pesach and I slaughter it for a shlamim offering. Okay, now that's what we call a Pesach shelo lishma, or an asham shelo lishma. Now, generally, the rules are any sacrifice that I do shelo lishma. This came up just recently. I can't remember if it was yesterday, 2 days ago, but it just came up. If I do something shelo lishma, what happens? Normally, we say the korban you've somewhat messed up the korban, but not entirely. You still sacrifice it on the altar, but the owner didn't fulfill the owner's obligation, okay? Because the owner was supposed to bring, let's say, an asham, and they didn't because you did the asham l'shem olah or something like that. So you messed up the korban, but it still is brought unless there's two exceptions to the rule, unless it's a Pesach or a chatat. If you do shelo lishma, it's disqualified. But with Pesach, it sort of depends. With Pesach, what does it depend on? It depends if it's the day of Pesach, where it's supposed to be offered, or it's any other day of the year. A Pesach is a type of peace offering, a type of shlamim. And therefore, if you offer a Pesach as a shlamim, and as I took aside the animal, I said, I want this to be for my korban Pesach. But then I offer it on the 11th of Nisan. And I offer it for the intent that it be a peace offering. Since a Pesach is a type of peace offering, this is valid. And it's a regular sacrifice. And I bring it as a shlamim. So what if I do a Pesach as a shlamim on Yud Daled, with the day that I'm supposed to do it as a korban Pesach? It's disqualified because that's a Pesach shelo lishma. But if I do it when it's not the time of Pesach, then it's going to be, and if I do a Pesach, let's say I take it on the 11th and I say I'm doing it as a korban Pesach, which I can't do because I can only do korban Pesach on the 14th, it's also disqualified. Okay, so it depends, right? There's all different permutations here. So let's go through what Rav Chisda says. Rav Chisda says, Pesach sheshachato b'chutz b'shar yemot hashana. Now we're going to have to say lishmo and shelo lishmo. So I did it outside on a regular day, not Pesach. So again, it'll be valid inside. If I did it shelo lishmo, I did it l'shem shlamim, then it'll be valid. If I did it l'shem Pesach, and it's the 11th of the month, right? Remember, Pesach's the 14th. Then if I do it shelo lishmo, l'shem Pesach, it's disqualified. So what if I took that animal that was the korban Pesach and I slaughter it outside the temple? Am I liable? I'm only going to be liable if the korban could have been valid in that way. So therefore, it's going to depend. If I did it lishmo, I'm exempt, patul, because I can't do a Pesach, l'shem Pesach, inside today because it's the 11th, not the 14th. But shelo lishmo chayav. But he says, if I do it shelo lishma, I'm going to be liable because I could have done it shelo lishma inside today. I could have brought it as a shlamim. Now, they're going to make a certain inference, which is a little bit difficult. I'll put that out there. So the way Rashi understands it, and the simple reading of the Gemara is quite difficult because they're going to infer from the fact that it says shelo lishmo, they're going to refer what would be the case if I did stama. I didn't specify at all. I just said stam. I said I slaughtered it without saying for Pesach, for shlamim. Now, you could either infer from the beginning part, lishmo patur, and therefore stam chayav, or shelo lishmo chayav, and therefore stam patur. For whatever reason, they're going to infer it from the second line. Okay, again, one could question this, and maybe there's a different way to read this Gemara, but we'll just read it this way anyway. Let's just take their inference. Tama de shelo lishmo. The reason why you're going to be liable is because you said, I'm doing it l'shem shlamim, and shlamim is valid inside on a day like today. But hastama, if I just slaughtered it without designating Pesach, shlamim, nothing. I just took the animal that I designated for Korban Pesach. On the 11th of the month, I slaughter it outside. So hastama lishmohu upatur. We must be, since you say shelo lishmo chayav, you're only going to be liable if you did it l'shem shlamim. But if I just did it stam, I won't be liable. We'll assume it's a Pesach. Amai, if you're going to say hoil, now here comes our question, because Rav Chisda is the one who said this halacha. Now, if he holds this se'ir that was supposed to go through the lottery, since I could use that se'ir potentially, if I wanted to, as a korban musaf, and I could do that right now, right? It's only mechusar's mom, but let's just say today I could do it, and therefore I'm going to be liable. So why wouldn't you say the same thing here? It's true, I didn't say shelo lishmo, but I could have potentially brought a shelo lishmo, and I didn't say lishma either. I didn't say it's l'shem pesach. I didn't say anything. So potentially that kind of thing I could have brought inside as a shlamim. So why don't we say I'd be liable? So that's his question. To which the Gemara answers, you're comparing two different things. Hachi hashta, hatam bayakira, hai labayakira. He's going to distinguish between Pesach and the se'ir. If I want to take that se'ir and use it for a korban musaf, first I designate it and I say I'm going to use this for the lottery, these two se'irim. Then I decide I'm going to take one of them and use them instead for a musaf, and I'll bring a new goat to replace that one. So as long as I haven't done a hagrala yet, I can just do that. I don't need to do any sort of formal process, nothing. I can just switch the goat, take it, put it somewhere else and bring a new one in instead. But Pesach, and this is going to be a machloket about it, but right now let's go with this opinion. According to Rav Chisda, we're going to say Pesach needs akira. If I designate an animal on the 10th of the month, let's say, for Korban Pesach, and the next day I decide to slaughter it, unless I say I'm slaughtering it as a shlamim, this still has the name Pesach on it. So I have to do some sort of act to uproot it, to say I'm using it shelo lishma. If I don't do that, then stam, it's going to still remain Pesach. That's why I'm not liable in a stam case, because I'd have to, so we don't use the law of hoil here, because you can't just say, oh, I could have used it as a shlamim, because I couldn't unless I actually stipulated I'm changing its status to a shlamim. I'm doing it shelo lishma. So because it needs akira, you can't just say hoil. Hoil is only when it easily can be switched without really doing any major akira, uprooting. Okay, so that's what he says. Now the Gemara says, Rabba bar Shimi ma'ne la b'derabba, v'kasha le'derabba aderabba, mushane kedishanim. Rabba bar Shimi holds that this whole thing was said by Rabba, and then questions it from something Rabba said, meaning everything where it says Rav Chisda replace with Rabba, and then learn the sugya that way. And the answer was given. It's the same thing. It's just reread the sugya by replacing the words Rav Chisda with Rabba, which is, as I pointed out before, the whole machloket of Hoil is with Rabba and Rav Chisda. So therefore, it's interesting. Again, the real big question is, how do these sugya compare, and why don't they really bring it up here? As I said, one says, these are different because it has to be done. That's dependent on, is not dependent on you. This one is dependent on you. Maybe that's one answer, but it's anyway a valid question. Now we're going to see two other approaches. So just to review, and you can look at the chart at the bottom of the first side of the sheet. Rav Chisda says again, you take this Pesach, you slaughter it outside the temple when it's not Pesach. If you did it l'shem Pesach, you won't be liable because you couldn't have brought it inside as a Pesach offering today, so you're not going to be liable for doing it outside. But if you did it shelo lishma as a shlamim, then you're going to be liable. Now we can forget about, for the meantime, the whole issue of the inference and what it says. What if it was stam? We can put that aside. But now we're going to talk about Rav Dimi. Ki ata Rav Dimi, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. When Rav Dimi came from Israel to Babel, he told them that Rabbi Yirmiyah said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, different answer to this question. Pesach sheshachado b'chutz b'shar yemot hashana bein lishmo bein shelo lishmo patur. If you slaughter this Pesach outside any day of the year, it doesn't matter lishmo or shelo lishmo. It doesn't matter if you said I'm slaughtering it for a shlamim. You're not liable. So the Gemara is going to obviously say, one we understand, the other one not at all. Amar Rav Dimi. So Rav Dimi himself says, Amarita l'shmate k'mei de Rabbi Yirmiyah. I brought this in front of Rabbi Yirmiyah, and I said to him, in other words, I said to him the following. When he told me this halacha, I said, but I don't understand. Bishlama lishmo, I understand if you did l'shem Pesach, that obviously you're not going to be liable because you couldn't have brought that inside today as a korban Pesach. It's the 11th of the month. Because it's not ra'oi for a korban Pesach. Ela shelo lishmo amai. But I don't understand why you say if I slaughter it as a shlamim, why am I not going to be liable? If I brought it inside today as a shlamim, I'd be able to sacrifice it as a shlamim. So why, if I sacrifice it outside, am I not liable? That's exactly a case where I'm supposed to be liable for shchutei chutz, when it could have been done inside as that, and then I slaughter it outside. Hachazeh shelo lishmo b'fnim. You could do it as a shelo, right? I can bring my korban pesach, my animal, and say, I'm bringing this as a shlamim offering, and it will switch. It'll just move into a shlamim. Va'amar li. So what did he say to me? And I asked him that question, and now he says the following: Akirat chutz lav shma akira. Not only do you need an akira, meaning you need to uproot it. You need to say, I'm using this for a shlamim in order to switch it. Otherwise, let's just put it this way. The Pesach status is strong. I designated this for Pesach. It's a Pesach until such point as I say, I'm changing it. But he adds one more element that Rav Chisda didn't say, which is not only do you have to, right? He disagrees with Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda wouldn't agree with him on this. He says, in order to uproot it, the uprooting has to take place inside the temple. In other words, when you're slaughtering it and when you're slaughtering it in the place where it's supposed to be slaughtered, that's when you can shift the designation of this animal, or you could even say the destiny, right? This animal, I destined this animal to be a korban pesach. If I want to change its destiny, I have to do it by an akira, an uprooting, and it has to be done inside the temple. So if I took this animal that I designated as my korban pesach and I slaughtered it outside the temple as a shlamim, that's a useless action. It doesn't turn into a shlamim. The only way I could turn it into a shlamim is to do it inside the temple. That's why he says, no matter what, you're going to be exempt, because it wasn't a shlamim. You couldn't have brought it as a shlamim this way because you didn't uproot it inside, right? Because you did it outside. So therefore, that's what he says. So we have Rav Chisda differentiated, l'shmo shelo l'shmo. We have Rav Dimi, who said in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah, said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that it's always going to be exempt because the akira has to happen and it has to happen inside. Now we're going to see a third option. Okay, we had number one, you have to do an akira, and that's why shelo l'shmo is going to, right? That's why this is different from the previous case that we saw with the seirim, which doesn't need any sort of uprooting. And that's why this one is going to be, we don't say hoil, that was our whole question. Then we have the second option, which is it's exempt across the board because it needs not only akira, but the akira has to happen inside. We're now going to see the third extreme, which is the other direction. Ki ata Ravin, and what's interesting about it is that Ravin now comes from Israel, and he says, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. He quotes the same people that Rav Dimi says that he agrees that there's no distinction, lishma, shalom, lishma, but it's the reverse. Instead of saying both cases are liable, are exempt, he's going to say both cases are liable. Pesach, sheshachato b'chutz, b'shar yemot hashana. Again, it's the same case. Pesach was slaughtered outside, not on Pesach. Bein lishmo, bein shalo lishmo. It doesn't matter whether you did it with the intent to be a Pesach or you did the intent to be a shlamim. Chayav, you're going to be liable. So now the question is going to be, okay, I understand why you're liable. B'shalo lishma, because you switched it, right? We're going to have to assume the akira can happen outside. You switched it to a shlamim. A shlamim could have been brought inside. Therefore, you're liable. But afilu lishmo, even if you did it l'shem Pesach, which wasn't valid inside, why are you going to be liable? And furthermore, they're going to question it from the following source. It says in a Mishnah, mechusar zman. Mechusar zman is an animal that hasn't reached its 8th day. It can only bring a korban from the 8th day of an animal's life. So mechusar zman, let's say it's missing bein begufo, meaning the animal itself has not reached day 8 yet. Or, and this is going to be our focus, we're going to leave the gufo aside right now, bein bebalim. What if the owners are not yet obligated in the sacrifice? Okay, so you have an animal you designated for, let's say you're a yoledet, you gave birth. Okay, we're going to see right now. What are the examples? Hazava, hazavava, yoledet, bamitzorah. Right? Most of these are on the 8th day. Some of them, the yoledet is on, day number, right? Remember, after her, either 80 days after birth or after 80 days or after 40 days of birth, the day after that, she goes and brings a sacrifice. So let's say one of these people brings their sacrifice before the day. Okay, let's say the yoledet brings it on day number 30. Okay, she brings the animal to the temple, and what does she do? She slaughters it outside. Or it's not that she brings it, right? She brings it near the temple. She has her animal. She designates it for the korban. She's not yet obligated to bring that animal as a sacrifice. And he krivu. Okay, so here, there's going to be a difference whether these people are obligated. Not all of them are obligated in all these offerings, but some have to bring a chatat or an asham or an ola or a shlamim. So we're now going to distinguish between chatat and asham, sin or guilt offering, versus ola and shlamim. What's the difference? Ola and shlamim can always be brought as voluntary offerings. Chatat and asham come for sins, or sometimes not necessarily sins. Like the yoledet brings a chatat, and there's always a question, why did she bring a sin offering? What did she do wrong? Right? There's the famous Midrash that said she swore that she would never have more children while she was in labor, right? But that's an excuse, right? It's really question, and maybe this is a proof that sin offerings aren't always specifically for sins, okay? But in any case, there's a bunch of questions about sin offerings. The Nazir also, what did the Nazir do wrong? Some people say he shouldn't have had to swear off of wine. Obviously, he had a problem. Anyway, they always ask these questions on some chatats that don't exactly fit the mold. But in any case, what do we see here? A mechusar zman, so we have this person who takes. Now, the chatat and the asham can only be brought when you're obligated for them, not if you're not. So chatatam v'asham, ikrivu chatatam v'asham b'chutz pturim. If on day number 30 of her birth, she brings this animal and she slaughters it outside the temple or has someone slaughter it for her. If it's the chatat v'asham, you're exempt. Why are you exempt? Because you can't bring a chatat and asham to the temple on that day. You're not obligated. But olotehem v'shalmehem b'chutz chayavim. Why are you chayavim? Because they could potentially be brought as voluntary offerings. You could have sacrificed it inside. To which we haven't yet gotten to the question. Amar Rav Chilkia Bartovi loshanu ela lishmo. This is only, okay, remember I told you in the beginning today, if you sacrifice an animal, shelo lishma, assuming we're going to go with the asham now, okay? When you say the asham and the chatat are b'chutz pturim, and now we have to ignore the chatat because I already told you the chatat is an exception to the rule of shelo lishma. If you do a chatat shelo lishma, it's disqualified. But if you do, like the Pesach, but if you do an asham shelo lishmo, you actually bring it. It just doesn't, you don't fulfill your obligation, but you do sacrifice it. So Rav Chilkia says, lo shanu ela lishmo, aval shelo lishmo chayav. He says the reason if you're going to be exempt when you slaughter this asham outside the temple, it's only if you slaughtered it l'shem asham. But let's say you slaughtered it l'shem olah or l'shem shlamim, which is not, you would end up sacrificing that inside. So if you slaughter it outside, you're actually going to be liable because it could have been brought inside. But we're still not up to the question yet. Lishmo mia patur. But it's clear though, if you do an asham, l'shem asham, you're going to be exempt. Now, if we say, okay, let's go back. What did he say? Pesach, okay, let's just go back to the beginning. Ravin. Pesach sheshachato b'chutz b'shar yemot hashana, bein lishmo, bein shelo lishmo, you're going to be liable. Okay, now, this asham, you're not going to be liable for if you did it l'shem asham. It's like the Pesach that you do l'shem Pesach when it's not Pesach and you can't bring it, and he says you're liable. So amai, nemaho iluruyin shelo lishmo b'fnim. Here, the asham, you're going to be exempt, you're going to be the Pesach. Why are you liable? Because even though I did it l'shem Pesach, I could have potentially done it l'shem the shlamim bifnim if I wanted. So likewise here, the asham, I shouldn't be exempt because even though I did it l'shem asham, came Rav Chilkia bar Tuvi and he said, if I do it l'shem asham, I'll be exempt. Even though, if you compare it to the Pesach case, why is Pesach liable? Even if you do it l'shem Pesach, which can't be brought today as a Pesach, because I could have done it inside as a shlamim. Therefore, likewise with the asham, I could have, if I had slaughtered it inside as a shlamim, I also could have offered it because it's a classic case of a shalol lishma, which gets offered anyway. So both of those seem to be the same. And in this case, it's clear from the Mishnah and the way Rav Chilkia understands it as I'm exempt, but by Pesach, I'm going to be liable. And they're really one and the same thing. To which he's going to answer, they're not one and the same. And now it's a little confusing because until now we keep saying that Pesach needs akira to switch it, right? He's going to have the reverse approach. He's going to say Pesach doesn't need akira and the asham does. So he's going to say here, hachi hashta, hatam by akira, hacha Pesach b'shar yemot hashana shlamim ninu. A Pesach is the easiest one to revert to a shlamim because a Pesach is a shlamim offering. It's a type of shlamim offering. And if you offer a Pesach on a different day of the year, even if you didn't do akira and say, I'm slaughtering this, and even especially, certainly you don't need your akira to be inside like we saw by Rav Dimi. And therefore he comes to the opposite approach. The Pesach, you're automatically liable because it's so easily switchable to a shlamim because a Pesach is a type of shlamim offering. And even we learned, if you leave your korban Pesach, you remember we learned this, if you forget, let's say you don't slaughter your korban Pesach on Pesach for whatever reason, your animal that you designated, it automatically becomes a korban shlamim because remember the Pesach has to be only within its first year. So it's not like you can leave it for next year. So you automatically, it reverts to a shlamim. So a Pesach, he has this opposite approach, doesn't need akira at all. It's the asham. If you want to turn it into something else, it needs akira, and you didn't do the akira here because you said it lishma. That's why lishma will be patur, shelo lishma will be chayav when it comes to the asham. But when it comes to the Pesach, you're actually going to be liable all the time because the Pesach can always be brought as a shlamim, and therefore you slaughter it outside on a different day of the year. It doesn't matter lishmo, lo lishmo, you're going to be liable. So we saw three approaches. I'll go through the three approaches and then what they're based on. Rav Chisda said, if you did it lishmo, you're going to be exempt because there's no such thing as a Pesach on the 11th of the month. Again, I'm just using the 11th as an example for any other day of the year, right? That's not Pesach. If you do it lishmo, though, you're going to be liable. Shelo lishmo, you're going to be liable because you could have brought it as a shlamim that day. Then Rav Yirmiyah said, no, you're exempt in both cases because he thinks not only does it need akira, but it needs akira, and the akira had to be inside. So really, until you do akira inside, you're actually just doing it l'shem Pesach. It still has the name Pesach on it, and therefore you can't bring it inside, so you're not liable for doing it outside. And Rabbanit has the opposite approach, which you're always liable because a Pesach is always considered really a shlamim offering. And therefore, any Pesach that's slaughtered outside, not on the day of Pesach, it doesn't make a difference for what purpose you slaughtered it, you're always going to be liable. By the way, you could also say a Pesach that you slaughter outside on Pesach, you'll be liable for. But we don't talk about that case. Okay, so now, and then it's based on whether Pesach needs akira, whether the Pesach needs akira and the akira has to happen inside, or the Pesach doesn't even need akira and it's so automatically a korban shlamim. Those were the three differences between the three approaches. Now we're going to have a little summary in the Gemara and a little bit of extra here. Rav Ashi matne chayav keda'amrinan. There was a debate about what Ravin really said. Okay, besides that, we have Rav Dimi and Ravin who each say different things. There was even a debate about what Ravin said. So Rav Ashi's version was that Ravin had told, remember, Rav Ashi is like the last of the Babylonians, that when Ravin came from Israel, he told, like it says here, you're liable in both cases. Rav Yirmiyah Midifti matne patur. Rav Yirmiyah Midifti's version had Ravin saying exactly what Rav Dimi said, that you're exempt in both cases. Kasavar Pesach b'shar yemot hashana by akira v'akira chutz lav shmei akira. This is just review. That if he holds the middle position, that you're always exempt, it's because it needs akira, needs to be uprooted. The akira has to happen inside. And since it didn't, because you slaughtered it outside and changed the name, changing the name is irrelevant, and therefore you're always not liable. Upliga de Rav Chilkiah bar Tuvi, and he disagreed, obviously, with Rav Chilkiah bar Tuvi's understanding, which is that the Pesach doesn't need akira at all. Okay, so these are the different approaches that we saw. That was all because we started with these two seirim, and if it's before the Hagrala, it can automatically revert to the seir because the seir doesn't need any sort of akira or anything. We can assume it could have been used for the seir for Musaf, and therefore if you slaughter it outside, you're going to be liable. That's how we got to this whole thing. But now we have the second part of that line of the Braita, which was Amar Misha Higril Alehem Chayav al Shashem Upator Shal Azazel. Once it went through the lottery process, one goes to Hashem and needs to be slaughtered, and one gets sent to Azazel, never gets slaughtered. And therefore, the one that's La Hashem, if you slaughter it outside, you're liable. The one that's La Azazel, since it doesn't get slaughtered anyway, if you slaughter it outside, you're not liable. Now we're going to have a Braita about this. How do we know that Seir Azazel is excluded from the laws of Shchutei Chutz? We're now going to have a drasha from the pasuk that's going to exclude it from laws of Shchutei Chutz. I'll give you an intro to this section. We're going to have it's excluded from the laws of Shchutei Chutz. Then we're going to have another law, which we already learned, which is that the animal has to be brought only on day number 8. And we're going to show that the Seir Mishalech is included in that law and not excluded. And I think what's going on here a little bit is this. It's a big question. We said this whole parak is going to deal with Seir Mishalech, Seir that goes to Azazel. It's very confusing to the rabbis. It's something unique that doesn't exist anywhere else. And the question is, how do we treat this? Is this a sacrifice to God, some type of sacrifice that's just not done in the typical sacrificial rites? Or is it something entirely different? And that's why we're going to take all these laws that relate to sacrifices and say, is this part? Is it not part? And there's a bit of confusion because they don't really know how to relate to this Seir Mishalech. It's a whole unique law that's very hard to understand. So let's see the different drasha. Tanu Rabbanan. Ish mi beit Yisrael sheyishchat shor or kesef or ez b'machaneh, or sheyishchat michutz b'machaneh. If you slaughter one of these animals in the camp or outside of the camp, bel petach o moed lo evio. The main point is you didn't bring it to the temple where you were supposed to. La'achriv korban la'Hashem, in order to sacrifice a korban to God. Now we're going to have to figure out how does this exclude the Seir Azazel. So first they're going to darshan a few things. Not all of them are relevant to us. Korban, if we just had the word korban, it says at the end, korban la'Hashem. Now korban doesn't always mean, we usually mean korban is a sacrifice. But korban could also be something, where does the word korban come from? L'karev, to bring close. It could be anything you bring to God. Like, for example, shomeani, I would have thought, afilu koche bedek habayit, shenik'u korban, kinyan shenemar v'nekrevet korban Hashem. In the battle with the Midyanim that comes up at the end of Sefer Bamidbar, we'll read it in a few weeks, they bring all the jewels from the Midianites to God, to the temple, so to the Mishkan. So it calls them Korban Hashem, even though they're jewelry, they're not animal sacrifices. So what do you see here? That Korban could relate to things whose value is sanctified to the temple. There's Koche Mizbeach, go on the altar, and there's Koche Bedek Habayit, things that go for upkeep of the temple. The money goes to be used for all sorts of things. So you might have thought Korban includes that if I took, now what's the case? I took an animal that was sanctified for its value not to go on the altar. I'll just mention this. We're going to learn this much later, but you're not allowed to actually do that. You can't take an animal and say, I'm giving its value to the temple if it can go on the altar. Because if it can go on the altar, it has to be for the altar. So it would have to be a case where it's a Baal Mum or something, it's blemished, and it can't go on the altar, then you can actually designate it for its money. So you might have thought, let's say I take a blemished animal and I slaughter it outside, you might have thought you'd be obligated from the word korban. Talmud lomar vel petach ha'moed lo evio. It's only kol ha'oil petach ha'moed chayav alav b'chutz. Kol she'ena ha'oil petach ha'moed en chayavim alav b'chutz. It's only something that could go in the temple. A blemished animal can't be brought in the altar. Therefore, it's excluded from this law. So that comes to teach you it's not bedek habayit, it's only things that go on the altar. But now we come to our point. We want to know what about the Seir Mishalech? Remember, we already know that it's going to be excluded. So how do they exclude it? Otzi elu she'en ru'in lepetach ha'moed. So then, okay, I understand I'll exclude everything that's not brought to Ol Moed. But what about velotzi? I would think maybe I don't exclude them. Parat chatat b'Seir Mishalech. Shiur ha'oil lavo petach ha'moed. Petach ha'moed can mean goes on the altar. But it also could be it's brought to the temple. Now, the Seir Mishalech, there's a bit of a problem with this parat chatat. Parat chata is the paraduma. And some people say there's a problem with the girsa because the paraduma is never actually brought to Ol Moed. Remember, it's all done at Har Zeitim. So it's a bit of a question what that has to do with Petach Ol Moed. But let's stick with our point, which is the Shiur Mishtalech. Shiur Mishtalech is brought to Ol Moed, remember? Goes in the sanctuary, and what do? They lined it up with the other one. They're both lined up. We do the lottery. One goes La Hashem, one goes La Sazel. It does go in Petach Ol Moed, so maybe that would be included. Talmud Lomar, La Hashem. Oh, it says Korban La Hashem. Now remember, one goes La Hashem, one goes La Sazel. This one isn't for God. This one is for Azazel, whatever that might mean. Okay, we'll get to some opinions about Azazel. Some people think that Azazel is some other like angel or bad spirit that we're offering it to, but it's not an offering to God. So therefore, Mishum Yuchadim LaHashem, Yatsu Elu She'em Yuchadim LaHashem. So there you have it. The word LaHashem in that verse comes to say, Shchute Chut, slaughtering something outside the temple, only applies to things that are brought into Ol Moed and are offered up to God. Shiur Mishtalech is brought into Ol Moed, but isn't offered up to God. So now the Gemara questions that and says, wait a minute. The word La Hashem, you want to think excludes the Shiur Mishtalech for reasons I said? I'm going to show you a case where the word La Hashem actually includes the Shiur Mishtalech, and that's in the law of the 8th day of the animal. La Hashem lahutzihu u'reminu, that contradicts the following source. Yeratzeh lekorbani shel Hashem. This is the verse that talks about after 8 days, the animal is worthy of being offered as a sacrifice. So now, Isheh sounds like Eish, fire. Elu Ishim, that means things that are offered up on the fire have to be 8 days old, right? So what does that mean? Minayin shalek dishenu mechusar zman, Talmud Lomar korban Hashem. So now they say, right, so the first thing it says is everything burnt on the altar has to be 8 days old, right? Coming from an animal that's 8 days old. And now they say, what about, right? Maybe you can't even, maybe you can't even designate the animal to be sanctified before it's 8 days old. And then they say, right, how do we know that you can't? Because it says, Korban LaHashem l'rabot Shiur Mishtalech. That comes to include even the Shiur Mishtalech can't be designated before it's 8 days old. Okay, so the word La Hashem here comes to include the Shiur Mishtalech. That's the exact opposite of what we saw before. The La Hashem excluded the Shiur Mishtalech. So Amarava, interesting answer. It all depends on the context. Hatam de'al petach l'rabot LaHashem lahotzi. In that verse, what happened? We said everything brought petach ol moed, which excluded beta kabayit, but that included the Shiur Mishtalech. So when you next have the word La Hashem, it's coming to respond to the previous. There it included. Now this is going to exclude, right? The La Hashem can say, well, not everything brought Ol Moed, only those that are brought Ol Moed, La Hashem, therefore it excludes. But hacha in this, hacha in our case, well, the case we just mentioned, the ishe lahotzi, ishe comes to say only things burnt on the altar. It's already very limited. So when it says La Hashem, it must be coming to include something additional that's not burnt on the altar. So therefore, La Hashem l'rabot. Okay, so therefore La Hashem comes to include. Again, as I said, right, when it comes to the animal being 8 days old, we're going to include the Shiur Mishtalech. It is considered La Hashem. But when it comes to the other Shchutei Chutz, we're not going to include it. So again, it's confusing exactly. And I think the rabbis, it goes depending on the situation. They sometimes view it like it's to God, and they sometimes view it not. As I said, it's a tricky concept of what exactly the Shiur Mishtalech is. Now they point out the following, which is Tama de Rabbi Rahman. This whole thing is because of a drasha in the pasuk when it comes to the 8 days. Halo Rabbi. Now, if you didn't have a drasha, what would you think then? So it's classic. If you have a drasha, it means that what would you have thought otherwise? You would have thought this seir is not included in the laws of the 8 days. But there's a problem with that. So if Lo Rabbe, Havamina, Shiur Mishtalech, Kadosh b'mechusar zman, we would have thought you could designate it less than 8 days old. But that can't possibly be. Because you can only have an animal stand up at the lottery if it can potentially be brought as sacrifice, because you don't know which seir is going to be for God and which lazazel. So you couldn't possibly put up an animal on Yom Kippur morning that was 5 days old, because it would have to be something that could be offered as a sacrifice, and it can't be on that day, right? So what's the Gemara thinking when it's telling us this drasha, that were it not for the word La Hashem, you would have thought that Seir Lazazel could be less than 8 days old. That's ridiculous. It couldn't possibly. So now they're going to try to find a way that it could be, okay, like a unique case where that could potentially happen, not a normal case, but a unique case. Amar Rab Yosef, Hamane Chanana Mitzri. You could say it's Chanana Mitzri's position, and you'd have to say it would happen in a unique situation. Ditanya, Chanana Mitzri Omer, Afilu Dam Bekos Mevi Chavero Misavegla. Let's say you take your two animals, we're going to talk about this much more tomorrow. You take your two animals and one drops dead. So let's say you have the blood in the cup from the Shiur LaHashem and the Shiur LaZalzel drops dead. So what happens? Mevi Chavero Misaveglo. You just bring a new Shiur, and that becomes brought as the Shiur LaZalzel. Sounds like it doesn't need to undergo another goral. If it doesn't need to undergo another goral, maybe in that case, you could take an animal that's 5 days old because you know it's going lazazel. You know it's not going on the mizbeach. So that could work. So you could say it's according to Chanana Mitzri, to which the Gemara says, no. What he's trying to tell you is you bring another one to match it up, meaning the first one doesn't have to get rejected just because, right? You might say it's rejected, and we'll talk all about this dichoy tomorrow, that the first one maybe was rejected because its pair died. So maybe you have to say that one can no longer be brought. And you might have thought, and comes Chanana Mitzri to say, no. You can bring a new one, but obviously it has to go through a goral because there's no such thing as Shiur LaZalzel without a goral. So what do? You bring a new goral, and then the one that's chosen, the goral LaZalzel, goes LaZalzel. The one that was chosen LaHashem, we just leave aside. We'll deal with it. That we'll talk about tomorrow. We also saw that in the Mishnah, what you do. But anyway, they're suggesting that's not a great answer because you could say delele dechuyim, but delele hagrala mishamatle. Who's to say it doesn't think it has to go through a hagrala? Once it has to go through the lottery, it obviously has to be potentially valid for a sacrifice, and it has to be 8 days old. So then you'd be stuck and you wouldn't really have a situation. Like Dilma Maite Umagil. Maybe you bring it and you put a lottery on. So El Amar Rab Yosef Hamani Rabbi Shimon. It's going to give a different answer. It's going to be 3 answers. The first one we rejected. Second, 2 are possibilities. You could say it's Rabbi Shimon Ditani. He says explicitly what we thought maybe Chanana Mitzri said, but no, he really says. Meit echad mehem. Maybe Chavero shelo b'hagrala divrei Rabbi Shimon. He says if one dies, you bring the other without doing any lottery. So then theoretically, you might have thought without the drasha, you could bring a 5-day-old animal for the Shiur LaZalzel. Ravina gives a different answer. Kigon shehumam b'chililo alacher. What if it gets a mum, the Shiur Mishtalech? Here again, is this like a korban or is it not? So we're going to say we treat it like a korban. If it's blemished, you can't use it. But what do? You just swap it and transfer the kedusha to a different animal and use a different animal in its place. At that point, maybe you could use an animal that's only 5 days old. But I'm using 5 as an example. It's anything under 8 days. Maybe you could. Comes the drasha to tell you, you can't. So those are some cases where potentially you might have thought you could use a younger animal. Now, the last part of the Gemara is Minat Tamer de Pasale Mum. How do we know that a mum is no good in a Shiur Mishtalech? So now we're going to have the same type of drasha we had by the 8 days. How do we know it includes Shiur Mishtalech? Also by the Baal Mum. And then we'll have a tzricha. Why do you need both? And then we'll end with that. Titanya. V'isher lo tiknu mehem. This is a pasuk about the Baal Mum. You can't put it up. You can't burn something on the fire from a Baal Mum, from a blemished animal. Elu hachalavim. That means you can't take the fats. They're supposed to be burnt on the altar from an animal that was blemished and burn them on the altar. Eli ala kulan. This is just a very aside thing, not having to do with our topic. It says miktsatan minayin. It sounds like all the chelav of a blemished animal. What if you took a small amount, like a kazayit, but not all of the fat of that animal? How do you know that you can't bring that either on the altar if the animal was blemished? Tamalomar mehem. From always means part and even not the whole. Mizbeach. So zrikat amin. The word mizbeach comes to teach you in that verse. You can't put the blood from a blemished animal on the altar. And LaHashem lirabot Shiur Mishtalech. Again, the word LaHashem in this case comes to include the Shiur Mishtalech. Also, the Shiur Mishtalech so it can't be brought from a blemished animal. So now they're going to do the itzrich. Itzrich lemich tabal mum, itzrich lemich mechusar zman. Both of those need to be mentioned. Why? We need they're both the same drasha. Hashem comes to include Shiur LaZalzel. Why wouldn't you just learn one from the other? So each has something unique that you might think you couldn't learn from the other. Why? It's not even, it hasn't reached the time when it could be offered. So of course you can't offer it for Shiur Mishtalech. It's true it's blemished, but it reached its time. It's at its right time. It just has to have a blemish. You might have thought not. Therefore, you need to teach also Baal Mum. The Ikat Rahman Baal Mum, let's say it only had the Baal Mum case, that you can't use that for Shiur Mishtalech, but you can have a Shiur Mishtalech that's too young. You might have thought, Mishum Demais. Baal Mum blemished? Oh, that's bad. Like someone who hasn't yet reached the right age there's nothing wrong with them. They just haven't gotten to the right age, right? So there's nothing bad and disgusting about that kind of animal. Emalo, you might have thought maybe it could be used. Sricha. That's why you need a drasha to say Mechusar Zman is a problem by Shiur Mishalech, and also Ba'almum is a problem. They're each unique, and that's why you need a pasuk to teach each one. And that's how we got off on this, because we started with La Hashem comes to exclude Shiur Mishalech from the laws of Shvutei Chutz, and then we questioned it from these, and with that we got off on a tangent about these, that sometimes La Hashem comes to include the Shiur Mishalech, and as I said before, this is a little bit about the dual nature of a Shiur Mishalech. It's sort of for God, but it's also not really for God. It doesn't have all the regular criteria of a korban, so what is applicable, what isn't applicable, it sort of depends on the situation. Okay, with that, I wish everyone a Shavua Tov and a good day. We'll meet up tomorrow.